gratification, but ultimately that's how I got him arrested. Now, keep in mind that not only was he teaching at the high school, where he was of no harm to someone like myself because I was too old for him, he ran the daycare center at Presidio Military Base. Now, the child daycare center at the Presidio Military Base had the potential for caring for 500 children, 500 children. Now, to put this into perspective for you, the Presidio Military Base was 1,500 acres. It was an enormous part of San Francisco, almost a quarter of the San Francisco city and county. Now, the Presidio Military Base was the Western Defense Command Center. It was responsible for the administration of the 17 Western states and for the occupied Kingdom of Hawaii, now a U.S. state. Now, this Presidio Military Base had an enormous amount of underground tunnels dug by the Ohlone tribe of American Indians who had been enslaved by the conquistadors. So the Presidio Military Base had buildings like such as the Presidio Officers Club that were 200 years old and as old as many of the buildings on the East Coast. Now, these tunnels were later reinforced and made into battery tunnels for massive artillery to shell any invading ships. Now, after World War II, they became lead-lined and concretized to house Nike Zeus missile system that could retreat back under the tunnels. And these were anti-ballistic missiles intended to take out any incoming ICBMs. That's how important Presidio Military Base was. Now, when the daycare center became a national scandal, they ordered me to destroy all of the maps of those tunnels. Now, no one that I know of has any extant maps of those tunnels. Now, to put all this into perspective again, when Gary Willard Hambright was finally indicted for his crimes, he was indicted for no less than 14 assaults against children who were all under 4 years of age. Now, this was by a federal grand jury that would have indicted him for many hundreds of more such crimes had he not died of AIDS. So it was calculated that he had infected no less than 500 children with AIDS. Now, that is a monumental crime against humanity, which the United States Army covered up. Now, one of the men who was accused of molesting the children was Colonel Michael Aquino. Now, ironically, while he could not walk around on Oprah Winfrey or Geraldo Rivera wearing a military uniform, he walked around Presidio Military Base in full pancake makeup with a widow's peak, clipped eyebrows, and a 666 tattooed to his forehead in full uniform because he was the officially recognized satanic chaplain of the U.S. Army. Now, I, in a sense, am responsible for his getting freed or getting relieved of a lot of the charges against him, because as his officially appointed liaison, a job which I held under orders, I must emphasize, this was not something I volunteered for. I had to present to the FBI and the CID, the Criminal Investigations Division of the U.S. Army, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, San Francisco Police Department, the fact that he was not on base during the time of the major childhood molestations. Now, in all fairness, all of the children who were showing signs of anal, vaginal injury, etc., these children were taken in automobiles by either the FBI, the San Francisco Police Department, other investigative agencies, and they were driven past Colonel Aquino's home right next to mine. He lives only a few blocks away from me. He's practically a next door neighbor, and he and I have lived in the same neighborhood for decades. Now, they were driven right past his home, and all of these children were able to identify it. And they all claimed that they had been taken in that home to what was known as the Black Room, entirely painted black, where he himself and Gary Willard Hambright were both dressed in woman's clothing, and Colonel Aquino's wife Lilith was dressed in man's clothing, and they were forced to perform unspeakable and heinous acts on each other and on themselves, and were, of course, molested and raped. Now, this was described at length and ad nauseum, not only in the Presidio military base, but also at West Point. Now, what happened at West Point was a young lady was brought in, probably around the year 1984, if I remember correctly. And this young lady had all of the normal injuries that abused children have. We're talking about anal rape, vaginal rape, and she basically was one of the first people. This was 1984. She was 3 years old. She was one of the first people to bring attention to the fact that the West Point Child Daycare Center, where all these children were forced to attend, was building number 666. And 22 months, just months before her case, there was a 22-month-old girl who had been murdered by a U.S. Army Staff Sergeant on West Point, and he was allowed to go scot-free. He was never punished. He never spent a day in jail. And all kinds of other children, many of them the sons of pediatricians, the daughters of military MDs, started complaining about being forced to eat feces, drink urine, rub all of these materials all over themselves. Well, guess who investigated all that and said that they were all literally full of it? Rudy Giuliani. Rudy Giuliani was in charge of the investigation. He said all these children just want attention. It's all childhood fantasies. Now, at that same time, a special investigative division was investigating all kinds of these crimes that were going on in Panama. Many other things were going on at many other military bases all over the world. And the end result was, thanks to men like Rudy Giuliani, all of this was dismissed. And the end result was, of course, men like Aquino walked free. One of the reasons why was because, again, professionally, I had to acknowledge the fact that, as far as I knew, being his liaison, he had never physically been on the base during the time of all the molestations. Right. Now, during that period of time, around 1986, 1987, he was basically doing a lot of work in Washington, D.C., and that, of course, is where West Point is at. So he was at the National Defense University, the George Washington University. He was getting his master's in public administration. Now, what's so interesting is, of course, in 1983, before that period of time, the Virginia County Police were asked to make an inquiry into the leaders of the Temple of Set. And they came up with some surprising facts. Aquino, of course, was an expert in the techniques of psychological warfare, a skill that was to prove useful to him in more ways than one. And what happened was, it was unveiled, and with what I already knew became public knowledge. He held a high-level international security clearance. He was on secondment to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and he was a member of the World Affairs Council. Now, what happened was the Virginian inquiry uncovered the fact that 12 other leading lights in the Temple of Set were U.S. Army intelligence officers. So he had a following that came to dominate U.S. military intelligence. Now, how this was viewed domestically was when Lieutenant Colonel at the time, James Channon of the 1st Earth Battalion, began to be used as a liaison and a consultant in occult crime, of all things, to police departments and federal investigative organizations all over the United States. The FBI, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the in Los Angeles Police Department, the Seattle Police Department. Now, everywhere that Colonel James Channon went, he told everybody, hey, you know all this satanic crime that Sandy Gallant and other people like her are investigating? You know, if you're a member of a religion, say you're a Roman Catholic, say some Roman Catholic bank robber robs a church, robs a bank, and he drops, when he leaves the scene of the crime, a Roman Catholic saint's medal. Does that implicate the Catholic Church? And they would all say, no, of course not. Then he would say, well, how about if you find a serial killer, you track him down to his home, and his apartment has got victims' heads, body parts all over the place, but he's also got a fetish for the Madonna Negro, the Black Madonna of the Polish Catholic community. Does that mean that the Polish Catholics are responsible for harboring a serial killer and producing one? And of course he said, no, of course not. So then he said, you have to do the same with the satanic religion. So at that point in time, FBI, all these federal agencies, the local police were ecstatic. They said, oh, great, that cuts our job down at least 25%. We can cut off all these investigations where we find a headless body in the middle of a pentagram. We can cut off investigating anything where we find black candles burning at the site of a crime, where a dog has been run over multiple times. We no longer need to consider these satanic. So the end result was pages and pages of satanic crimes investigation techniques that had been incorporated through the professional work of investigators like Sandy Gallant were removed from investigative field manuals of federal departments and from local constabularies. And as a result, the wave of satanic crime came to an end. And that's why whenever they find a body now, headless in the middle of a pentagram, it never makes the news because they don't report it, meaning the police. They will dismiss it and say, oh, that's freedom of religion, and just because whoever did this follows that religion does not condemn that religion of Satanism.